Hello everybody, some kind of cyborg here, bringing you my first video game review. Before we jump in, I'd like to first just highlight a couple of the things surrounding this game that I believe are symptoms of the current decline and growing anti-consumer practices within the gaming industry.
Dying Light 2 features a functioning ecosystem that reacts on multiple levels to the things you do and the choices you make.
I bring this up because I believe Dying Light 2 has leapt headfirst down a number of these pitfalls. If you'd like to skip past this part, I have timestamps throughout the video for ease of navigation. I think there is a clear-cut argument to be made for early marketing material surrounding this game, misleading players in regards to the experience they will be having whilst playing. As far as I'm aware, the van chase sequence is straight up not in the base game, and you will not be seeing hordes of NPCs battling it out on rooftops or in the streets, and the faction system is an incredibly surface level affair that essentially only exists to facilitate various unlocks and decide who gives you your quests. There are points within the game where you make decisions that create branching paths, though for me their degree of consequentiality is ultimately up for debate as the end destination is the same. The early trailers for this game inferred a constantly evolving world that responded and reacted according to the decisions of the player, and though this is technically correct, it ultimately boils down to what suits you will see some NPCs wearing and what skins lay over the top of a couple of buildings. It was marketed as some grand RPG experience, and though it certainly isn't that, I can at least say there were points in the story where I decidedly did want to invest in one faction over another, not just for unlocks, but because of one story draw or another. Ultimately, it is an RPG light experience, and your choices only end up dictating which NPCs will be following you into various segments of the game, who you take your quests from, and whose voice you will be hearing over the radio. For one reason or another, you will still be taking on the majority of the game's missions solo, and your faction allegiance is of little consequence. The gaming industry appears to more and more be relying on hype culture, by which I mean marketing material surrounding games misrepresents what the key focuses of that game will be according to popular trends, or focusing on moments within a game that are actually so minor on the grand scheme of things, they couldn't possibly represent the core experience of what a game is all about. I believe Dying Light 2 also suffered from this hype mentality. I'm at a point now where I rarely buy into trailers or marketing material, having been stung one too many times. And I now approach each new release with caution and a critical eye. I encourage all of you listening to approach such materials with the same mentality. In my opinion, this intentionally misleading marketing was done for the same reason as all other marketing, to make money, to drive up pre-orders so shareholders could guarantee not just a return on investment, but a solid profit at the expense of consumer goodwill. As a consequence, there will be many who pre-ordered this game or purchased on day one who will no doubt be disappointed with the overall product, and I couldn't blame them for feeling that way. More and more we see game companies cash in on consumer goodwill for short-term gains at the expense of long-term trust. That being said, I believe Techland, the game developers, are not necessarily responsible for all of these marketing decisions. I'm not giving them a free pass, nor am I saying that they didn't at least have a finger or two in the pie or are beyond criticism. But they are a company which I honestly do believe still deserve our tentative trust. I'm no fanboy by any means, but going off their track record of continued support for Dying Light 1 and the solid roadmap proposed to support and continue development for Dying Light 2, I am for now willing to give them the benefit of the doubt. I'm currently running this game on a GTX 1066GB and a Ryzen 3700X, so in terms of graphics, I can only convey the experience that such a mediocre setup allows. That being said, once I spent a little time tinkering with the settings, I got a consistent 60fps experience on upscaled low graphics and a playable experience on medium. I didn't suffer a single crash, and once I found the correct settings, the FPS only dipped in the most extreme of circumstances. In my opinion, the game still looks fantastic for the most part. In particular, the draw distances from atop the skyscrapers in the second area of the game are truly breathtaking, and the setting of the game itself carries the visual element of the game, Rooftops are covered in sprawling greenery, and both the internal and external areas feel like lived-in locations that served a purpose before everything in the world went to hell. It's easy to make FPS locations feel more akin to paintball arenas than a place you could conceivably see existing in the real world, but Dying Light 2 avoids that trope completely through what seems to me to be painstaking attention to detail. Admittedly, a few locations do reuse assets or layouts, but I personally am not all too bothered by that, as for the most part I'm simply rushing through and beating in zombies or scavenging for loot before bailing out of a window and moving on to the next area at a breakneck pace. I didn't feel that the reused assets and similar interiors were enough to detract from my experience, but I'm putting it out there as a consideration for others. That being said, I'll still give Techland props for creating one of the least gamey feeling settings I've seen in a modern FPS. In terms of enemies, there isn't that much variety in the base fodder. There's a couple different types of base zombie, and though the human enemies look like they're straight out of Thunderdome, after a number of hours you'll probably start picking up on the similarities. The same goes for the non-hostile filler NPCs. The wider variety then comes in the form of the volatiles and virals on the zombie side, and lieutenant boss characters for the human. The story NPCs are kind of a mixed bag. Some look like they're made out of Play-Doh, while others honestly look fantastic. You can tell a lot of time and attention went into representing what a character is all about through their appearance, but it seems as though not all the NPCs were given the same tender love and care. Unfortunately, it seems as though the level of gore from the first installment has been toned down somewhat, along with the removal of the X-ray component from critical hits. You can still dismember, decapitate, stomp, alight, and electrify, but it feels as though the damage model has been reworked in the new engine. Honestly, through all the viscera spewing out of enemies, I was hard-pressed to notice, and it's something which only became apparent to me once I'd already sunk a considerable amount of hours into the game.
I got something for you, you piece of shit.
It isn't all high praises, however. The game isn't without jank, and though the developers have already put out bug fixes and promised more down the line, I am going to comment earnestly on my experience. There were times where enemies would phase in and out of reality, merge with floors, doors and walls, and occasionally get stuck in T-posing animations when I killed them. Ultimately, it wasn't enough jank to ruin my experience or deter me from playing, and I'm willing to let it slide as I have with other games in the past. The game itself has earned enough on its merits that, for me, I'm willing to look past this lack of polish and eagerly await the inevitable patches that will come down the line. Though this may be a deal breaker for some, and it's worth considering picking up the game a couple of months from now once things have been smoothed over. I have also read reports of game-breaking bugs soft-locking players into locations they have found themselves unable to escape from, as well as some bugs that brick saves. With the removal of manual saves, this is essentially a death sentence for a player's run. That being said, I myself have not experienced any of this, but did decide it was worth a word of caution. I think it's also worth mentioning that the game's OST by Olivier Derivière, I'm sorry if I butchered that, absolutely slaps, and it's a fantastic accompaniment to the various stages of the game. It seems as though there is a soundtrack for every activity and key moment within the game, from soaring, triumphant orchestral scores when navigating the piercing skyscrapers to grungy synthwave when traversing the game at street level. When playing through interiors or grappling around at dizzying heights, the tracks also take on various airy or echoing effects, which make them an absolute treat to listen to when you first notice. The game takes place in the fictional European city of Villador, and the first area of the game presents a very authentic European terraced locale where street level is rarely more than 2 floors from the lush safe haven of the rooftops. The roads are tight and claustrophobic, which lends to the sense of dread and desperation should you find yourself mistiming a jump at night and tumbling down between the maws and grasping hands of the undead population. The second area of the game is much more open in its layout, with a combination of open squares and wide streets surrounded on all sides by dizzying skyscrapers. Though overwhelming at first, this second area becomes infinitely more accessible with the paraglider and grappling hook unlocks, as well as some level progression parkour skills and abilities. Once you start unlocking some of these features, the open world truly becomes a blank canvas of player skill and expression. There is plenty to do and explore in each of the game's distinct locations, and beyond exploration for its own sake, players are further incentivized to dominate their surroundings by taking on a plethora of almost entirely optional and rewarding extras. Some of the more scathing indictments I have read of this game are in its comparisons to open-world Ubisoft titles, which in my opinion have seen a steady decline in quality over the years. It's a genre which has become increasingly diluted in its repetition and uninspired design, a la the Far Cry and Assassin's Creed series. Dying Light 2 incorporates elements that fans of open-world games have seen before, but Techland clearly had a consistent and true to themselves vision to best implement these features into their own game. None of them feel like they exist simply to tick boxes. To me, they feel like areas designed to challenge players' game knowledge and skill in one aspect or another and reward them accordingly. Various landmarks can be found around the game world. They confer electricity or water to areas of the city that can be claimed, unlocking new safe havens from the ever-encroaching night, a place to rest, and shopkeepers selling gear, resources, and blueprints. Windmills, which serve as parkour trials, fill a similar function, while for the combat-oriented, there are renegade outposts, which can be claimed via open confrontation or taken on using the game's admittedly basic stealth mechanics.
You ain't getting away.
Beyond that, there are military convoys, GRE quarantine zones, and anomaly sites, which serve as arenas in the night to take on some of the more ferocious virals the game has to offer. All of these locations are interspersed with mini-quests, whether that be finding an item for an NPC or saving someone locked in a brawl with a zombie. For the most part, these mini-quests are relatively cookie-cutter experiences, designed to give the player options for additional experiences and loot as they traverse the open world. Early on, I felt the plethora of map markers and pings to be a little overwhelming. Once I progressed a little further, however, I realised these were for the most part completely optional, and there was no pressure to play the game any other way than how I wanted to play it. The day and night cycle of the game completely shifts how a player approaches some of these challenges, and can be responsible for directly dictating the success or failure of your ventures. During the day, the zombie population is sparse, and humans both passive and hostile can be seen gathering in the streets and on rooftops going about their business. As night descends, however, it is an entirely different story. The humans retreat to the safety of UV-bathed outposts and ramshackle fortifications, for the night belongs to the Horde. Zombies, as well as the recently turned unstable virals, pour from their nests and fill the streets. Villador during the day is a playground, while at night it becomes a battle for survival, where the rooftops are your island, and the streets become a gnashing and clawing sea of putrescent flesh. I found myself playing a completely different game during the night, and was gasping and shouting as I outran the pursuers of an accidentally triggered chase sequence. I found myself utilising all the skills, tricks, and map knowledge I had acquired through the day to simply keep myself alive at night. It is truly an absolutely clenching endeavour, and I give Techland props for creating such a dynamic experience. It isn't all doom and gloom once the sun sets, however. As the zombies leave their nests under the cover of darkness, it becomes possible to access indoor areas that would have been 100 times harder during the day. There are subground metro complexes that can be unlocked as fast travel points, and dilapidated stores brimming with goodies for the savvy night runner to find. Not to say these areas are completely without a couple of their necrotic residents, but it was infinitely more manageable accessing these locations during the night if I decided I was willing to brave the howler-filled streets. The atmosphere in these areas was palpable. As I snuck from table to table or skirted around the sleeping hordes, it felt like I was playing a true horror game. Gone was the power fantasy the game had engendered in the open world, where safety was never more than a few wall climbs and mantles away, and instead it was replaced with a palpable dread, knowing that all it took was one or two fumbles and the nest would awaken and set upon me, with its menacing volatile guardians leading the charge. Without going into any spoilers, I'll simply say Aiden Pearce is built different, and it shows in his ability to fluidly traverse his surroundings. In my opinion, this is one of the best and simply outright fun parkour experiences in video gaming since my first run through of Mirror's Edge. Early on, it's all simple enough, with Aiden only having access to a basic repertoire of free-running skills, jumps, mantles, wall hangs and the like, but But as the game progressed and I began to level him up, the game opened up in a big way. Before too long, I was running along walls, combat rolling from great heights to mitigate damage and maintain pace, and mantling objects to explode through the air, covering inhuman distances. I've heard some reviews say the parkour feels grounded, and I personally disagree. This is a power fantasy game through and through, with Aiden's inhuman strength and speed at the forefront of all his traversal, and Dying Light 2 is all the better for it. Even before I had unlocked all of the abilities, the fluidity with which I moved through Villador felt to me a testament to its excellent level design. From the first mission to the last, it is an absolute pleasure to get around on foot, and I rarely found myself using the fast travel points because I had so much fun getting from A to B. The routes you choose to take through the city are limited only by your imagination, and Dying Light 2 accomplishes this without sacrificing the authenticity of its environment. As I said earlier, Villador feels real. If you can pull yourself from the parkour to look around, it's not hard to imagine how the city would have functioned before the fall. It is a playground, but it achieves this without sacrificing the believability of its lived-in environment. The first area of the game also serves as an excellent tutorial-esque area without being handholdy, where the heights aren't too imposing and the rooftops are easily reaccessed should you take a tumble, whilst later you are soaring through a city skyline and grapple hooking around skyscraper exteriors 100 floors up. Aiden's progression felt natural to me, rather than gated at any point, and as I progressed through the game to unlock the grappling hook and paraglider, my confidence had increased along with him. Later areas were ostensibly more difficult to access at a glance, but I had acquired more skills, both in-game and at my keyboard, to tackle them with increased creativity and expression. The parkour system feels increasingly rewarding as you master it, and Dying Light 2 is a game I could recommend on this system alone. It's also the reason I'll be playing this game long after the story is said and done. The combat has been overhauled significantly from the first game. In a world without access to bullets and firearms, folks have had to get pretty medieval with their methods for dispatching enemies. Throwables are pretty underwhelming on the whole, with grenades knocking out as much concussive force as a wet fart. The throwing spear, however, absolutely slaps and will dispatch most enemies instantaneously. Whether this focus on melee combat is a deal breaker for you is down to personal preference. It seems firearms only existed in the first game because of the time frame it took place in and as a method for dispatching similarly armed human enemies. Don't expect to come into this game running and gunning your way through it. For me, it was honestly a little disappointing, and it will no doubt disappoint others. But as I further got to grips with the melee system, I found myself thinking their removal was perhaps for the better. The combat incorporates more finesse and options than the first game by a large stretch. Aiden is an absolute unit, parrying, dodging and grappling enemies to temporarily stagger them, before leaping off the backs of these staggered enemies to deliver a payload from the twin howitzer cannons, otherwise known as his legs.
Order up!
Early on, you're going to find yourself simply swinging left and right quite a lot, but as you level up and engage with the mechanics of combat, a plethora of options will open up to you, and options is the name of the game here in Dying Light 2. You can simply hold block to negate incoming damage, but if you wait until the last possible moment, you will instead parry an enemy and throw them off kilter, leading to massive damage. Once you unlock the slide ability, you can sweep an enemy's legs from beneath them and leave them vulnerable on the ground. You can unlock a sprint and tackle ability that lets you run through entire hordes of enemies like you're the coal train. There is also the option to dodge to the back and side, and with the right skills, this too can leave enemies open with another stagger window. Movement and combat have been expertly married by Techland to create an experience which is greater than the sum of its parts. I honestly don't know if I'd enjoy the combat anywhere near as much if it were any other game, but it's so satisfying to me going from a rooftop parkour segment, leaping off with a paraglider, and then ground pounding the first group of enemies I run into to initiate a fight. Aiden is an absolute monster, incorporating maximum violence, speed, and momentum into his entire kit. In terms of weaponry, it is not the most expansive affair at first glance, with most weapons falling into two simple and distinct categories, one or two-handed. The distinctions then come in the form of stats attached to weapons and the ability to install mods which confer various elements. These can allow you to further focus on incapacitating enemies or doubling down on damage. Alongside this, there is a reworked armor gear system which will allow you to lean further into your weapon and playstyle preferences. On the whole, the combat feels good. It's weighty and responsive, and some of the enemy ragdoll effects are absolutely comical. Once I unlocked a couple of Aiden's additional abilities, I felt like a one-man wrecking crew. All that being said, I did feel the game was a little too easy on normal difficulty. The additional weapon effects from mods were nice, but I still often found that enemies went down just as easily with or without them. To me, the game feels like it actively encourages making your own fun within the combat system. Whether or not this is a good or bad point for you is going to come down to personal preference. In regards to the story, I'll first say that I can respect Techland for trying to make the story of Dying Light 2 somewhat engaging. It was one of the weaker aspects of the first game, and you can tell they wanted to make it a key focus of the second one. Unfortunately, to me, it felt like a big swing and an even bigger miss. Most of the time, I was hammering the spacebar to skip dialogue so I could get back to doing what I enjoyed in the game. It's such a shame to me that the story was one of the focal selling points in the hyped up advertising preceding the game's release, and it failed by such a large margin. It wasn't a deal breaker for me, as I went in not expecting anything grand. But if you are coming into this game expecting to be engaged by a compelling narrative, I feel as though you may be sorely disappointed. The argument could easily be made that the story is not the game's focus, that instead I should be content to engage with the parkour and combat mechanics, but that feels like something of a lazy cop-out. You can tell Techland wanted the story to be a focal point of the game, and some may enjoy it, but I personally found it an absolute chore to engage with the majority of the game's cast. To me, it is all simply a vehicle to progress Aiden to different points of the game, and that is the best thing I could say about it. The antagonist is a Saturday morning cartoon villain, and you can tell what a character's entire shtick is after the first interaction. In some segments, characters were killed left and right, and I could tell the game wanted these to be powerful, emotive scenes, but it had not done any of the prerequisite legwork to get me at all invested into any of these people. When they died, I literally felt nothing, which is a damn shame when you can tell that this game believes it has a heavily character-focused narrative and was marketed as such. I liked the first guy you meet, and despite Aiden being sucker-punched in virtually every single cutscene, I kind of liked him. Not exactly the praise Techland was going for here, I'm sure. It's difficult to do a story right in an open-world game, and Techland 100% missed the mark here. The characters all felt tropey and underdeveloped. You could probably guess their responses to any given situation. And despite hours upon hours of story-focused content, there were only a few instances where I felt my decisions ultimately amounted to anything. It's a damn shame, but I have nothing to say about the story beyond it being all around pretty bad. I haven't yet seen a section in reviews dedicated entirely to gripes and complaints, so I thought I'd take a go here. These may not be enough to deter you from buying the game, but they are things that happened enough that I felt it warranted having its own section. Fighting on slanted roofs is damn near impossible. There are a lot of rooftops in the first area of Villador with slight inclines around the windows. When you are on these surfaces, you're locked into a sliding animation which makes it impossible to attack, whilst your aggressors suffer no such penalty. Survivor Sense is back from the first game, a ping system which highlights any loot in the area and enemies through walls. It felt lazy then, and it feels lazy now. It's my opinion that in an open world game where looting is a key focus, there could have been a more natural way to visualize to a player that there is loot in a certain area. I also found that my survivor sense would randomly not work at times despite me mashing it, which was pretty annoying considering there are some areas in the game where it is essential. In Dying Light 2, there is no option to throw your weapon, and you have to cheese durability repairs. In the first game, when a weapon was close to breaking, you could choose to throw it, inflicting huge damage on an enemy and getting one last hurrah from your weapon, or you could fill your backpack with low tier weapons and just hurl them all over the place. I have no idea why they removed this system. There is also no option to directly repair your weapon. Instead, you restore a portion of your weapon's durability whenever you install a mod. It leads to a pretty silly situation where you get a new weapon with 3 mod slots, but in order to min-max its lifespan, you have to wait for your weapon's durability to drop before installing anything on it. I'm also not a huge fan of the binocular system. It's a method used from vantage points to ping areas of interest and mark them down on your map. To me, it feels like it breaks up the flow of gameplay, and I found it really finicky at times to lock onto and ping a location. If it could mark enemies prior to taking over an outpost, for example, I could perhaps excuse its inclusion. As it stands, however, I'm simply not a fan of its implementation. Techland are not a multi-million dollar company. They are barely AAA, and with that being said, I am impressed with the level of polish this game released with. It is a sad state of affairs that I expect open world games of this scope and scale to release as half-finished train wrecks. I am happy to announce, however, that Dying Light 2 is anything but. Whether that is deserved praise or not, I will leave for you to decide. I think as gamers, it is not an entitled view to have that we should expect games to release finished. It is an unfortunate sign of the times, however, that I'm happy I can play a game on release from start to finish. This is the kind of game that some will instantly click with, but others may be looking for more. The combat and parkour mechanics of this game are excellent and highly encourage player experimentation. I personally am a fan of such design philosophies, but it may not be for everyone. If you're coming into this game expecting to be gripped by a narrative tying together the gameplay loop, this certainly isn't for you. If you are a fan of open world games where you are content to be left to your own devices and make your own fun within the game's systems, however, I can only recommend Dying Light 2.